Imagine Rome not as a tourist ruin, but as it truly was, colossal, alive, pulsating, a center of power where emperors decided the fate of millions, where legions crossed continents, where the known world revolved around its commands. And now imagine that same Rome plundered, violated, reduced to silence and smoke. The fall of Rome was not an isolated event, nor a single day of defeat. It was a slow, corrosive process born of mistaken decisions, internal betrayals, and external forces that Rome ignored for far too long. In this video, we will walk step by step through that collapse. We will discover who these so-called barbarians really were, and why they were merely the final page in a story that had been crumbling for centuries. Because every ruin has a beginning, and Rome's began at its peak. In the 1st century BC, Rome seemed invincible under the rule of emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan. The empire reached its greatest expansion. From the forests of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, from the banks of the Rhine to the heart of Mesopotamia. It was a colossus covering nearly 5 million square kilometers, home to more than 60 million people. 1 out of every 4 human beings on Earth lived under Roman eagles. The Pax Romana ensured 2 centuries of relative stability. Paved roads connected cities across thousands of kilometers, aqueducts carried drinking water to arid regions, laws, currencies, languages, and architecture created a shared identity. Legions maintained order, commerce flourished, everything worked as far as the eye could see. But behind that facade of order and power, something was already breaking. The empire was too large. Each new province required more soldiers, more administrators, more resources. The economy relied on vast estates worked by enslaved labor. When conquest ceased, the flow of new slaves diminished, and the productive base began to fail. The empire had grown on the foundation of constant war, but when expansion stopped, the model began to self-destruct. Tax pressure increased, the free population grew poorer, and the cost of maintaining the state machinery year after year exceeded its capacity to collect revenue. From the 2nd century onward, the empire began suffering a silent hunger, not for food, but for currency, for circulation, for economic oxygen. Trade routes that once supplied Rome with goods from India, Africa, and inland Europe started to break down. Constant wars, piracy, and instability on the borders made transportation difficult and expensive. Without steady tributes from distant provinces and without new conquests to fund the imperial machine, Rome fell into fiscal collapse. To maintain armies and public works, the state began debasing its coins: less gold, less silver, more copper, more devaluation. Inflation skyrocketed, a sack of wheat could double in price within weeks. Confidence in the monetary system vanished. The weight of taxes fell hardest on small landowners, artisans, and peasants. Many couldn't sustain their lands, others simply abandoned them. And that's when a new model emerged. Seeking protection, thousands voluntarily submitted themselves to powerful landowners, offering their production in exchange for safety from soldier tax collectors or bandits. This model of direct dependency, where peasants worked for lords in exchange for shelter and protection, was the embryo of what would become feudalism centuries later. But its roots lay here, in the bankruptcy of a state unable to guarantee justice, security, or sustenance. The economic collapse didn't just weaken Rome, it planted the seeds of a new order born of desperation. If the economy was collapsing in silence, Roman politics was making plenty of noise. From 235 AD onward, the empire entered a period historians call the military anarchy. In just 49 years, over 20 emperors ascended the throne, most of them assassinated, deposed, or killed in battle. No regime was stable, no throne secure. Generals were proclaimed emperors by their own troops. Military campaigns stopped being directed against external enemies and turned inward, legion against legion, province against province. Every corner of the empire tried to impose its own authority, and the unity of Rome unraveled from within. Meanwhile, the frontiers remained unprotected while legions were occupied in civil wars. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, Sarmatians invaded Pannonia, and armed bands ravaged entire regions. Cities lost their protection, and the population began fearing both enemies and its own soldiers, who looted Roman villas and cities as if they were foreign lands. Historian Zosimus described this period as one in which Rome seemed to devour itself, and he wasn't exaggerating. Imperial authority was no longer respected, it was fought over like loot. Power ceased to be a symbol of order and became a prize of war. To survive this chaos, Rome needed reinvention, and the first attempt came with a drastic decision: divide the empire in two. In 285 AD, Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy, a government system with 2 Augusti, emperors, and 2 Caesars, vice-emperors, each responsible for part of the empire. In practice, Rome ceased being a unified empire and began functioning as 2 separate worlds, East and West. The logic was administrative: each half would manage its own crises with its own armies and capitals. But the division, though useful in the short term, created an irreversible fracture. The Eastern Empire, with urban centers like Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, was economically stronger, with better trade routes, fortified cities, and more defensible borders. In contrast, the Western Empire was the opposite. With its capital shifting between Milan and Ravenna, the Western Roman Empire faced constant invasions, irregular harvests, demographic crisis, and a chronically underfunded army. While the East consolidated its authority, the West lost it. The city of Rome itself, although still symbolic, was no longer the center of imperial power. It was within this weakened empire that the barbarians found their opportunity. But who were they, really? In Roman minds, barbarian was a convenient label, a way to classify all those outside the Greco-Roman world, who spoke strange languages and did not follow Roman laws or customs. But that word concealed more than it revealed, because the so-called barbarians were not a uniform group or a primitive horde without culture. They were diverse peoples with their own identities, religions, alliances, and strategies. Among them were the Goths, divided into Visigoths and Ostrogoths. Semi-nomadic Germanic peoples who had served as federates in the Roman army for decades. There were also the Vandals, who crossed Gaul and Hispania before settling in North Africa, where they formed a powerful fleet. The Saxons and Franks expanded along the Rhine frontier, and the most feared of all were the Huns, coming from the Central Asian steppes, fast, violent, unpredictable. These groups didn't necessarily want to destroy Rome, many wanted to enter, participate, and benefit from what it offered: land, security, status. Some were integrated as allies and even received official titles such as Duke, performing administrative and military functions within the empire. But Roman arrogance made genuine coexistence difficult. Even when barbarians were accepted as allies, they were treated with suspicion, contempt, and constant betrayal. That fragile diplomacy wouldn't last forever, and the peoples who once knocked on the gates would soon break through them. And when they started entering, the consequences were irreversible. Because the barbarian migrations, contrary to popular belief, were not spontaneous attacks. They were the consequence of something much larger and chaotic. The so-called barbarian invasions weren't only planned military campaigns, they were primarily movements of survival, massive displacements of entire populations, tribes, clans, women, children, pushed by factors Rome neither controlled nor understood. The first major cause was external, the arrival of the Huns from the Eurasian steppes. These nomadic horsemen were fast, violent, and merciless. Their presence on the eastern borders of Europe sowed panic among Germanic tribes settled near the Danube. Peoples like the Visigoths and Vandals fled en masse, seeking refuge within Roman territory. But there were also internal causes. The scarcity of fertile land in the origin regions of these peoples, combined with population growth, forced migrations in search of better conditions. And Rome, even in decline, was still seen as synonymous with stability, wealth, and future. For many barbarians, entering the empire was an opportunity for survival and advancement. The problem was that Rome no longer had the structure to absorb so many people. Borders were weak, officials were corrupt, and resources were scarce. Attempts to negotiate integration failed due to bad faith, disorganization, or prejudice. What could have been a cooperative relationship turned into conflict. Migrations transformed into avalanches. One tribe pushed another, which pressured yet another, and thus they all moved, some seeking peace, others seeking plunder, and the increasingly unstable empire had no strength left to respond. For centuries, Rome knew how to use the so-called barbarians to its advantage. Many were incorporated as foederati. Entire peoples authorized to live within the empire in exchange for military support. In practice, this meant that thousands of Germanic, Allan, Vandal, and Gothic soldiers served under Roman banners, defending borders, patrolling roads, and fighting common enemies. Some even reached high-ranking positions. Barbarian chieftains received titles such as Duke or Comes, governed entire regions, and even married into the Roman aristocracy. It appeared to be functional integration. But beneath that appearance of alliance was constant tension. Romans didn't see them as equals, even when they performed essential services. Barbarians were treated with suspicion, humiliation, and disdain. Promises of land and provisions were often broken, bribes were demanded, food was denied, and physical abuses occurred at the hands of local governors. This systematic contempt transformed allies into enemies. And in 378 AD, that tension exploded in the Battle of Adrianople. The Visigoths, having been mistreated by Roman authorities while seeking refuge, rebelled. Emperor Valens' army marched to confront them, confident but unprepared. The result was total annihilation. Valens died on the battlefield, and nearly two-thirds of his army was destroyed. The defeat was not only military, it was symbolic. It showed the world and the empire itself that the barbarians were no longer extras, they were protagonists, and Rome was no longer invincible. And while the Goths etched their name into history, a new threat approached with fury and speed, a name Rome would never forget: Attila. While Rome was still trying to deal with Goths and Vandals, a new force emerged, wild, swift, and unpredictable. Coming from the Central Asian steppes, the Huns seemed like a nightmare come true for the Romans. They rode small but agile horses, used composite bows capable of piercing armor at distance, and fought with brutality that unsettled even the most hardened soldiers. But the real terror began in 434 AD, when Attila took command. Attila united scattered tribes, imposed discipline and strategy upon nomadic warriors, and transformed the Huns into a transcontinental power. He was not only a military leader but also a political leader, a shrewd diplomat, and an implacable strategist. He negotiated with Rome when convenient and destroyed entire cities when necessary. Under his command, the Huns invaded the Balkans, threatened Constantinople, demanded exorbitant tributes, and devastated fields and villages from the Danube to the Black Sea. And when he turned his gaze westward, chaos spread like fire. Roman sources didn't know how to describe him, so they called him Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. Not because they were religious, but because they could find no other explanation for such horror. But Attila wasn't done yet. His most ambitious strike was still to come, a campaign that would bring the Roman Empire to the brink of collapse. In 451 AD, Attila launched his boldest offensive, the invasion of Gaul. It was more than a campaign, it was an attempt to break the backbone of the Western Roman Empire. Cities fell one after another, terror advanced, and collapse seemed inevitable. But against all odds, an unlikely alliance arose. Flavius Aetius, one of the last great Roman generals, managed to assemble an army composed of imperial soldiers, Visigoths led by King Theodoric Imaro, and other federated peoples. It was the last line of defense. The empire literally placed everything it had left on the battlefield. The confrontation happened at the Catalonian Fields, one of the bloodiest battles of late antiquity. Attila was contained, Theodoric died in combat, and although defeated, Attila managed to retreat with part of his forces. Rome breathed for a short time. The following year, Attila returned, this time to invade Italy. Cities like Aquileia were razed, the entire peninsula fell into panic. Rome itself seemed doomed. But then something unexpected happened. Pope Leo I personally met with Attila. No one knows exactly what was said between them. Some speak of a miracle, others of bribes, political promises, or threats of imminent plague and famine. The truth is that Attila withdrew. Rome was spared once again. But barely 2 years later, Attila died. His nomadic empire fragmented, but the damage had already been done. Rome had survived physically, but psychologically it was already on its knees. And the worst part was that even before Attila threatened its gates, Rome had already been shaken by a blow impossible to ignore. In 410 AD, the Eternal City, which hadn't known invaders for nearly 8 centuries, was taken. And the culprit was not a distant enemy, but a frustrated former ally, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. For years, Alaric had served Rome, fought as a general, sought agreements, demanded payments, but was repeatedly ignored, betrayed, and humiliated. When he realized the empire would not honor its promises, he made a historic decision: march on Rome. The city was no longer the administrative capital, but it remained the symbolic heart of the empire. And when the gates opened, there was little resistance. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted temples, mansions, warehouses, and monuments. There was no indiscriminate massacre, no total destruction, but the impact was devastating. The world watched in astonishment. For contemporaries, this was not just a raid, it was the end of an era. Saint Jerome wrote, horrified, "The world is in ruins." Alaric did not destroy Rome physically, but he shattered its myth, and the myth was what still held the empire together. In the eyes of many, from that moment on, the idea that Rome was invincible was broken. And if the Visigoths proved that Rome could fall, the Vandals would show a few years later that it could be plundered again, and with even greater precision. 45 years after Alaric, Rome would be sacked again, but this time the brutality would not come by land, but by sea. In 455 AD, Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, crossed the Mediterranean with a powerful fleet, landed on the Italian coast, and marched directly toward the city. Rome was once again defenseless, its army practically non-existent, its government unstable, the emperor assassinated days earlier, leaving a power vacuum. There was no resistance. For 14 days, the Vandals executed a meticulous plunder. Unlike the Visigoths, who acted out of frustration and urgency, the Vandals had a plan. They knew exactly what they were looking for: gold, silver, jewels, statues, religious relics, even the ornaments from the Temple of Jerusalem brought by Titus centuries before were taken.